Our performance review series flips over to the defensive side of the football, and we take a look at Miami's defensive front, the performances from 2023, where Miami can hang their hat, and where things may need to change moving forward.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. Today's Friday, January 26th, and today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 moneyline bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. We are focused on the defensive front, and the entire defensive side of the ball is very suddenly in a little bit of flux because Vic Fangio is obviously no longer the defense coordinator. We did the emergency podcast on Wednesday night when that news came through. What the Dolphins ultimately end up doing with that coaching staff position, whether it's Coach Campanile as an internal hire. Adam Schefter's reported that Brandon Staley will be visiting this weekend as a potential candidate to fill the role externally. And he, of course, with stops in Los Angeles as a head coach for 3 years and on Sean McVay's staff after working under Vic Fangio for one season. There's some connections there that would make some sense, as well as some other candidates that maybe would be different scheme changes as well. But that's a story for a different day. The good news is whoever's going to come in and be this defensive coordinator is going to look at this defensive line group, and it's going to be clear as day. This is one of the strengths of the team, and that's whether Christian Wilkins is back next year or not. Yeah, there's some injuries that you may have to work your way through the first month of the season, but look at the talent that's available in this group. This was the group that I think of all the performances on both sides or in all three phases of the game, this was the group that had the highest of expectations that I think delivered on exactly what you hoped and thought that they could. There was a player in Christian Wilkins who was playing for a contract. There was a player in Bradley Chubb who was capable of being more than what he was when he came over from the trade deadline. You had a first-round pick in Christian Wilkins. They paid Zach Sealer. All of these players, you got about what you were looking for, and then you also had performances from guys like Andrew Van Ginkel that maybe you weren't expecting you were going to get. So the Dolphins finished this season defensively with 72 quarterback knockdowns, according to Pro Football Reference. That is the highest figure of any team in the NFL, tied with the Detroit Lions in the regular season. Their 56 sacks were third in the league behind only the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens. And that's a franchise record for number of sacks. From an actual pressures perspective, they finished third in the league in pressures behind the Detroit Lions and the Kansas City Chiefs. Their pressure percentage of 27.7%. So on 27.7% of attempts, pressure is produced, is also third in the NFL behind Detroit and Kansas City. In front of the New York Jets, Houston Texans, Green Bay Packers, Cleveland Browns, Seattle Seahawks, Buffalo Bills. Some really good defenses. So you give credit where credit's due. I certainly think when you foil that with what Miami did from a run defense standpoint as well, from a yards per carry perspective, Baltimore lit them up. Yeah. The Chargers in week one lit them up. Yeah. They were finished tied for fourth in the league in yards per attempt at 3.8 yards per attempt allowed. And from a raw yardage perspective, their 1,650 rushing yards conceded was seventh in the NFL behind Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, New England, Tampa Bay, Houston, and then Miami. Pretty good performances in both a metrics of pass rush and run defense for a defense that is geared and predicated towards winning in the box And that starts with these two guys inside. And obviously, Raekwon Davis is a player that we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But what you had with Christian Wilkins and what you had with Zach Sealer was one of the defining variables of the strengths of the team. And Christian plays 894 snaps defensively this season. That's down about 60 from what he did last year, which is just an insane number. I'm sure there was probably an appetite to have more rotation from this group. You saw Deshaun Hand and Raekwon Davis playing some even front type stuff. They're just frankly not that kind of player. Zach Sealer in his first year with the new contract plays 856 snaps defensively across all 17 games. So these guys were both available for both games. They both played about 80% of your snaps. Both of them played 190 plus snaps on special teams as well. Like these were pillars of your roster type players. And they combined for 19 and a half sacks or 19 sacks. Christian Wilkins almost doubles his career sack total this season. He got 9. Zach Sealer hits double digits. The first interior guy in Dolphins franchise history to hit double-digit sacks. He does double his career sack total in one season. And you contrast that to the gap control style defense that Miami had played previously under Brian Flores and Josh Boyer. And there's no doubt that scheme change unlocked the best of those guys. You'd love to keep that group together. We'll see what happens with Christian Wilkins. But what I do know is if you looked at the expectations for those guys and you knew how important they were going to be, and we talked about the lack of depth behind them in August, they played the volume of snaps. They absolutely delivered. They were big time in pass rush elements. And it's hard to ignore. It's easy to take for granted, but it's hard to ignore. And just kind of fleshing out both of these guys, particularly from a pass rush perspective, I think everybody knew they were good against the run. Zach Sealer's previous high was 3.5. His previous high in quarterback hits was 12. He had 22. He has 4 passes defense to the line of scrimmage. The forced fumble, obviously the interception on Will Levis in primetime that's returned for a touchdown. 11 tackles for loss, which also ties a career high for Zach Sealer. Christian Wilkins, his previous high in sacks was 4.5, so he doubled it. His previous high in quarterback hits was 13. He got 23. So both of these guys like doubled their career high, not just sacks, but quarterback hits. So they were more frequently around the ball than ever. Christian Wilkins, maybe not quite the same activity around the line of scrimmage when he's not getting home. His passes defense, he only had 2. That's the lowest figure he's had since his rookie season, just to keep the presentation of facts. And his tackles for loss went down 6 from the previous year. He had 10 this season, which is the second highest figure he's had in his career. So credit where credit's due to both of these guys, where this was a big pain point and stress point about, do we have enough? You're darn right you got enough with salt and pepper inside. And whether or not salt and pepper stays, it's not really up to us at this point in the game. That's up to Miami and Christian Wilkins and his camp to try to find the right compromise in availability. And we'll see if they do. We're going to shift gears to the top 3 edges. Jaylen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, and Andrew Van Ginkel up next year on Locked On Dolphins, continuing our performance assessments from the 2023 season. That's next. Stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off of our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you, and it's important that you let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. So today, I want to give you the opportunity to think about therapy. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, even if it's the Dolphins. And it's important to get things off your chest. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. The NFL Conference Championship games are here. So this season is just about done, but there is still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. It's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use. There's a ton of different ways that you can get in on the Action Live same game parlays. You can find bets in the Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, which is the best way to find popular parlays and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. So, pillars of the defense, Zach Sealer, Christian Wilkins this year were exactly that. Bradley Chubb, I think, deserves a ton of credit as well. He led this team in sacks with 11, and he was tied for second on the team in quarterback hits with 22. Bradley Chubb kind of comes in with very heavy expectations, having been acquired at the trade deadline for a first-round pick. Plays in 16 games, which ties a career high for him. He played in 16 games last year, but played hurt with Miami with an ankle sprain after coming over from the trade deadline. He played in 16 games as a rookie. So the third time in his 6-year career, that he's played in 16 games. And obviously there's a long-term conversation about the commitment and the investment that Miami has made in Bradley Chubb and his long-term health. Right now, we're just hoping that the ACL recovery for him and rehab process goes smoothly. But when he was on the field this year for 16 games, there's a firm case to be made that Bradley Chubb was your most consistent performer that played from September through January. He obviously misses the playoff game against Kansas City. He misses the finale against Buffalo. He played most of the Baltimore game. He set career highs in a number of statistics. He did not set a career high in sacks. He set a career high in tackles. He set a career high in quarterback hits with 22, surpassed the previous high, which came with 21 during his rookie season. He led the league in forced fumbles with 6. There's some fumble luck there, that there were a few more that he forced that he potentially could have finished and got even more turnovers. He finished the year with 836 snaps played for you defensively. That's about 80% in the games that he dressed this season. This Fangio scheme does require some dropping into space in your base fronts as an added zone defender. And Chubb did pretty well in that regard as well. He was targeted 9 times on the season in zone coverage. And on those 9 targets in coverage, he conceded 29 yards in completions. So obviously this isn't a huge ball hawk or anything like that. I think the one thing with Bradley Chubb that stands out when you see him on film and you see some of the opportunities that he has and the plays that he influences, I was so used to last year having a conversation about Bradley Chubb and talking about pressures being valuable over sacks because they're impacted the play. But Bradley Chubb felt like he had a lot of pressures that could have been sacks if we finished plays more consistently. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that he had 15 missed tackles this season at a 17% average. And a lot of those came in the backfield on potential splash play opportunities. So if I were to provide constructive criticism for where I think Bradley Chubb, who I think was phenomenal this year in its totality, becomes a even more impactful player, I think he sets a career high in sacks, and I think he maybe kind of takes it to a whole new level if he were to able to finish some of those missed opportunities in the backfield. But he was very confident and comfortable in this scheme, and he played like himself, like the top 5 pick that he was when he first came out of NC State. That's the player you can expect to see when he's 100%. When will he be 100%? I don't know. Well, that's a conversation for another day. But if you recap this season, one of the formulas for how Miami's defensive front delivers on all the expectations that they had and the pressure that they had, Bradley Chubb was a big part of that. Which takes us to Jaylen Phillips, another player who was outstanding when he was available. Unfortunately, he played in about half the games this season, and it was a big loss for Miami. Now, I think you had Andrew Van Ginkel step up in a big way. We'll talk about him next. But Jaylen Phillips, this was supposed to be the year that this guy becomes a perennial double-digit sack guy. And I'll be darned if he wouldn't have been it for sure. You look at the trends for Jaylen Phillips. His rookie season, he had 8.5 sacks and 16 quarterback hits. And he did that in 600 snaps defensively. Year 2, He has 7 sacks and 25 quarterback hits. So his quarterback hits are way through the roof. He just doesn't quite have as many finished sack opportunities. And he does that on 840 snaps. So you take that, and then you consider the fact that he played 367 snaps defensively this year. It's about 60% of what he did as a rookie, and it's closer to a little under 50%, 45% of what he played last year in 2022. And in that small of a sample size, he had 6.5 sacks and 11 quarterback hits. I mean, if you just doubled the snaps, you're talking 700. You're still 120 snaps short of what he did last season. And he'd have had 13 sacks and 22 quarterback hits. So I think you feel really good about Jaylen Phillips, the long-term forecast here. And when he was out there, he was everything as advertised. There's no question. But we got off with a weird Friday practice injury that cost you the Patriots game. And then it cost you a couple other games. It cost you the second half of the Denver game. And then he doesn't play for 2 weeks. So you missed the Buffalo game, and then you missed the Giants game, and then you're back against Carolina, and you're really on a snap count, and you play versus Philly. And against Philly, started this stretch of 5 straight games where Jaylen Phillips had at least 1 sack, and then he goes down for the year with the Achilles against the Jets in that 5th game where he logged his 5th consecutive game with a sack. I'm so super excited for Jaylen Phillips that the injury timeline will obviously get a better picture of throughout the course of this offseason. But don't let this be out of sight, out of mind. And the contrast here is pretty jarring. Jaylen Phillips was credited with 1 missed tackle this season. Now, were there always the best angles in closing down, or did we give up outside contain when we're closing in, playing off a contact? Yeah, there were a few times where that happened for sure. But he was in the zone. And I can't wait to see what it looks like when he comes back, because when the Dolphins have to, and this is kind of a big picture conversation that runs in tandem with all these individual conversations, there's going to be a point in time where the Dolphins are going to segue a big contract out. And Jaylen Phillips is probably going to be one of the new big contracts for the new chapter of the organization. And when that happens, it'll be really well-deserved, because he as a talent is right up there with all the best of them. And I'm really excited to see what that looks like. But that's what 24-year-old Jaylen Phillips' season was about. Man, if we'd have been healthy, that'd have been the year where we'd have looked back and seen it. And I hope next year is the year where that does happen. Now, we have Andrew Van Ginkel, who came back to Miami on a 1-year deal, pretty economic deal. And he as well set a bunch of career highs. He sets a career high in sacks. 6 sacks beats the previous high of 5.5. He is right up there with his career highs in tackles for loss and quarterback hits. He had 19 quarterback hits this year. He had 8 tackles for loss. He has a pick 6, touchdown against Washington, 8 passes defensed. Obviously played a little bit more in coverage. That's a career high for him. So this became kind of a glue guy player for Miami. Plays 725 snaps for you defensively this year. And that was supposed to be your 3rd guy. It was kind of an overlooked signing. Guys like Van Ginkel on a 1-year, $2.5 million deal, and guys like Deshaun Elliott, who we'll talk about when we do the defensive back performance review. Some of those economic contracts really stand out. I know we mentioned Kendall Lamb when we did the offensive line review, and the price point and the amount of snaps that you got and the quality of snaps. Van Ginkel's right up there near the top of the list for most economic contracts on the team. You're probably not going to get that chance again next year. That's it. We'll see what happens with, obviously, the scheme change, departure, Vic Fangio leaving to go to Philadelphia. Incredible how quickly that came together for somebody who was under contract with another team. But that's neither here nor there. This segment is giving flowers to a group of guys who all deserved it. Just like Christian Wilkins and Zach Sealer, this is a big love fest on the defensive line performance review, because this was one of the best defensive fronts in football. And their ability to consistently deliver on it Maybe not wire to wire because of who they lost throughout the course of the year. But, the Jaylen Phillips injury for a lot of teams would have been catastrophic. And the Dolphins defense took it as relatively in stride as you possibly could because Andrew Van Ginkel was there to catch that volume of snaps, obviously over 700. Now we have some other guys on the defensive front. We have got Emmanuel Ogbah, Raekwon Davis, Deshaun Hand. We'll talk about those guys next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. The absolute best way to stay in the game when the Dolphins aren't playing is to make sure you got a little skin in the game for yourself. And that's why I get checked out PrizePicks, largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS because it is you against the numbers instead of battling against thousands of other players, including pros and sharks. You pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections in-house. If you win, you watch your winnings roll in. If you correctly get 6 picks with your stat picks on a PrizePicks combo, you went up to 25 times your money. So if you're a big fan of good ROI, PrizePicks has got you covered. There's quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of player and stat types, all that make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100. That is prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100. PrizePicks, daily fantasy sports made easy. So the rest of this group is kind of where the wheels fall off a little bit. I reflect on Raekwon Davis, who was a second-round draft selection for the Dolphins in 2020, and he comes in this year, and you were kind of hopeful. There's been some added weight to play nose tackle. There's been some weight cut to try to be a little bit more dynamic of a player. He's always routinely been around 45 to 50% of the defensive snaps played in all 4 of his seasons. Obviously, the big scheme departure change. He still played 498 snaps. So he played meaningful snaps. And Raekwon finishes with a career high in quarterback hits. He more than doubled his previous total from his first 3 seasons in quarterback hits. But you're looking for, particularly at nose tackle, a certain kind of consistency at the line of scrimmage. And I think Raekwon has been left a little bit because of how his career has evolved. He's been left a little bit in between. Or if you're going to be a nose tackle, like be a rock, right? Who's really hard to move. And there's times with Raekwon Davis because he's 6'7", and anybody who's been a regular listener to the show in the offseason, I'm just, continuing to say the same things over and over again. But when you're 6'7", it's really difficult for you to consistently leverage against double teams and hold ground at the point of attack. And if you're not doing that, then there's a pretty good chance you're not consistently playing in the backfield. And because he is more of a true nose tackle, it's not like he has a first step like the other 2 guys, Sealer and Wilkins, do. And he's 3-4 inches taller than those guys as well. So it kind of puts you in this weird limbo, and I think that's really well evidenced by Raekwon Davis as a nose tackle who's primarily a run defender. His career high in tackles for loss is 2, and that came this year. There's just not enough plays or resetting on the other side of the line of scrimmage. Now, there's plays where we're going to be in our tight fronts and we got our guards that are covered up by interior defensive linemen. We're going to leave Raekwon Davis one-on-one with a 300-pound center. Now, Raekwon can toss that dude around. But if you're going to be base nickel 70% of the time, that's really mitigating the value. So the other 30% of the time, sure, you're on the field, and then you can rotate 20% of your snaps as in the nickel defense, but the impact's just not the same. So as an expiring contract, if you told me that Raekwon Davis were to go somewhere else, and maybe they wanted to evolve him back into a true nose tackle and put some more weight back on him to be a little bit more forceful at the point of attack, I wouldn't lose sleep over it to try to find a replacement there for Raekwon Davis. I think he's a quality depth player in the NFL. I do think if you're putting him through the box of a nose tackle, you probably want a little bit more rigidity. If you're putting him through the box of an even front defensive player, you'd like a little bit more explosiveness. And I think this season, with the scheme change and some of the weight drop, certainly seems like we've got a big enough body of work now that there's enough limbo that I think you could pick a different lane for probably a similar commitment to what Raekwon Davis will command on the open market, and probably get a better version of either two of the two things that Raekwon Davis could be, but maybe necessarily isn't consistently. Which brings us to Emmanuel Ogbah. Emmanuel Ogbah certainly had productive pass rush reps. I don't think that consistently was particularly high. I didn't think he necessarily played the run at the standard that we had come used to during his prior 2 seasons in Miami in 2020 and 2021 when he earned that big contract extension. At the last 2 years combined, like we haven't played 600 snaps combined, and we played 793 and 755 snaps those first 2 seasons in Miami. So different scheme change. Vic certainly was not an advocate for Ogbah as an edge player who was not playing without his hand in the dirt, and I'm inclined to agree with that. But I think if you were to look at Emmanuel Ogbah's season in its totality, I do think it does lie to you a little bit. Like the 5.5 sacks is nice. It's a strong figure for this Dolphins team. It's 6th on the team in sacks behind Chubb, Sealer, Wilkins, Phillips, Van Ginkel, guys we've all talked about. Ogbah's 6th on the team in sacks with 5.5. But he had a 17% missed tackle rate. In addition to that, his pressures this season, he had 15 on those 250 snaps played. His quarterback hits, he got the quarterback 9 times for quarterback hits. He made 3 tackles for loss. This was a player when he was peaking in Miami was making 3 times that many plays. Now you could say, well, if he played the full body of work, the volume would have been there. Sure. But when you watched him play, I thought there was a noticeable drop in the athletic ability relative to your starting players, your top 3 players. I thought all 3 of them moved better, and this scheme prompts you to play a little bit more in space instead of being tight alignments and having somebody who's rushing outside of you lined up to give you extra leverage outside. And I think when you convert into, there's a lot more wide 9 alignments in this defensive scheme. I thought that really amplified where Ogbah's a good fit in some ways, but maybe not necessarily in the ways that are most frequently called upon in this defense. And then Deshaun Hand would be the last name that I would call out here that would give us 9 guys in this conversation. And Deshaun Hand was somebody who in the preseason you were hopeful for a 4th interior defensive lineman to emerge. Because Brandon Peely's the guy who makes the initial 53-man roster. Hand, you get a little bit of a look at in the preseason. You say, hey, well, he's played meaningful snaps and for a couple stops in like Detroit. He didn't necessarily get a ton of run with Tennessee last year, but he played 350 and 450 snaps in his first couple seasons on his rookie contract. Maybe there's something there. He ends up playing 198 snaps for the Dolphins this year. 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack, 3 quarterback hits. And the sack came against the Jets with that defensive front. So you acknowledge the issues that offensive line faced. The tackle for loss also came in that game as well. And Deshaun was somebody who I think proved with the body of work that he had, especially relative to the talent of the guys at top on the depth chart. That's a player I think you could probably find that level of production from in a lot of different places. And thankfully, your primary 2 guys stayed healthy inside. Had they not stayed healthy, I think that would have created a whole different set of problems that we thankfully don't have to really consider because that didn't happen amidst all the things that did happen on an injury front. So your pillars are your pillars. Whether the Dolphins make the financial commitment to bring one of those pillars back in Christian Wilkins, that's a conversation for another day. Whether or not the pillars are healthy enough for the start of the season between Bradley Chubb and Jaylen Phillips is a conversation for another day and will be an ongoing storyline throughout the course of the season. But I look at the body of work from what you got with the guys, and then including Jaylen Phillips missing half the season and Andrew Van Ginkel's role in stepping up in front of that. And I got a lot of respect for the performance that these guys put out. I think they lived up to lofty expectations. I came into the year thinking this was one of the best defensive fronts in football. And the statistics of both the run and the pass rush specifically speak to that, which isn't necessarily the case for other stops along the way on this roster. And we'll talk about those as we continue our performance review series. I'm Kyle Krabs. That is going to do it for me here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Fins up. I appreciate you guys checking the show. I'm out of here. Peace.